They had once believed themselves invincible. In 1939, on the dusty plains of Manchuria, Japanese tank officers watched their sleek new machines roll across the terrain light, fast and beautifully engineered. The Type 95 Heigo was the pride of the Imperial Japanese Army, a mechanical promise forged from the nation's obsession with precision and discipline. Against Chinese forces, these tanks had swept the battlefields clean. Against the British in Malaya and the Americans in the Philippines, they seemed unstoppable. The myth of their superiority grew not from propaganda alone, but from genuine triumphs, victories earned through speed, surprise, and the illusion of technological mastery. But like all illusions, it would shatter not with artillery or rockets, but with something far more humbling, a stream of 50 caliber bullets. The story of how U.S. Marines discovered the fatal weakness of Japan's most common tank begins years earlier, at a time when the world still thought in steel and horsepower rather than data and supply chains. In 1933, Japan's Army Technical Bureau issued a call for a new kind of tank lighter, faster and more adaptable to Asia's rugged geography. The country's existing Type 89 medium tank, heavy and slow, could barely keep pace with motorized infantry. What Japan envisioned was not a fortress on tracks, but a sprinter, a 7-ton vehicle that could cruise at 40 kilometers per hour, support troops in open terrain, and above all, be built quickly and cheaply by a still-developing industrial base. The contract went to Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, the empire's mechanical heart. The lead designer engineer Tomio Hara had already earned respect for his innovations on the Type 89. Now he would create something that reflected Japan's strategic philosophy, that agility and morale could overcome material inferiority. Hara's design was elegant, almost minimalist. It used a bell crank suspension system simple enough to produce en masse, yet flexible enough to traverse uneven terrain. The engine, a 6-cylinder air-cooled Mitsubishi diesel, was efficient and fire-resistant, consuming cheaper, safer fuel than gasoline. For the Japanese military, this was progress, an affordable tank for a growing empire. By mid-1934, the first prototype rolled across test grounds in Manchuria. Observers were stunned by its speed. It could maintain 45 kilometers per hour on paved roads, a remarkable feat for its size. The Type 95 Heigo felt light, almost eager, gliding across muddy fields that would bog down heavier Western tanks. To its designers, it seemed perfect, the manifestation of Japan's belief in spiritual willpower and mechanical discipline. But hidden within that triumph was the seed of failure. The suspension bucked violently over rough ground, exhausting crews and making accurate fire nearly impossible while moving. Still, to an army chasing momentum and myth, such discomforts were tolerable. The Army Technical Bureau approved modifications and pressed ahead. In 1935, after political wrangling between infantry and cavalry branches, the former demanding thicker armor, the latter insisting on speed, the tank was officially adopted. Its name came from the imperial calendar year 2595, shortened to Type 95. Production began in 1936, and Japan's mechanized dreams became steel reality. The tank was small, only 4.38 meters long, 2.06 meters wide, and a little over 2 meters tall. A man of average height could see over its turret. At just over 7 tons, it was lighter than many trucks, but what it gained in mobility, it sacrificed in protection. The thickest armor was a mere 12 millimeters, designed to deflect rifle and machine gun fire, not armor-piercing rounds or anti-tank shells. Yet in Tokyo's war colleges, this was seen as rational. The Hago wasn't meant to fight tanks. It was meant to dominate infantry and outmaneuver sluggish Western armor. Inside, the conditions were punishing. The crew of 3 driver hull gunner and commander were crammed into a steel chamber barely larger than a kitchen stove. The commander, perched in the turret, had no seat. He was simultaneously gunner-loader and radio operator. Most tanks lacked radios altogether. Only 1 in 4 had one installed. Orders were relayed with flags or shouted over engine noise. Still, the crews adapted. They memorized signals, rehearsed reloads, and trusted in their machine. The Type 95 became their iron companion, its rumbling diesel engine, a lullaby of national pride. When war broke out in China in 1937, the Hago found its purpose. Against Chinese infantry armed with rifles and light machine guns, it was devastating. The 37mm cannon shattered bunkers, and the twin 7.7mm machine guns tore through enemy lines. Its speed allowed Japanese forces to execute encirclement tactics with shocking precision, driving Chinese troops into panic. To Tokyo's military theorists, it seemed proof that Japan had found the perfect balance between speed, firepower, and efficiency. The tank became a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. Chinese soldiers nicknamed it the Steel Locust, fast, relentless, and deadly in swarms. Its presence reinforced the Japanese doctrine of spiritual victory through motion, a philosophy that prized willpower and initiative over armor thickness or gun caliber. Within the Imperial Army's command circles, the Hago's success was interpreted not as luck or context, but as destiny, evidence that Japan's approach to mechanized warfare was superior to Western theory. But history would soon prove otherwise. In 1939, the Japanese army met the Soviet Union at the border of Mongolia near the Khalkhin-Gol River. There, against Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 tanks equipped with 45mm guns and thicker armor, the Hago's vulnerabilities were exposed. Its cannon could not penetrate Soviet armor frontally, while Soviet shells sliced through its 12mm plates effortlessly. The battle was a slaughter. Dozens of Japanese tanks burned on the plains, their diesel engines melting into slag. For some officers, the lesson was obvious. Japan needed heavier, better protected tanks. But within the Imperial General Staff, pride blinded reform. The official reports described the defeats as tactical missteps, not design flaws. They doubled down on the same assumptions that had guided the Hago's birth, that Japan's tankers could compensate for inferior armor through speed, surprise, and morale. That illusion carried into the Pacific War. When the Hago rolled ashore in Malaya in 1941, it again seemed unstoppable. British commanders had dismissed the idea that tanks could move through jungles. Japanese crews proved them wrong, weaving through rubber plantations and ambushing enemy columns. In the Philippines, the Hago faced the American M3 Stuart, another light tank, and even managed some tactical successes in close jungle fighting. Once again, experience reinforced the myth, but all myths end somewhere. For the Hago, that place was a volcanic island in the Pacific Saipan, June 1944. There, amid the crashing surf and burning sugarcane fields, the tank that symbolized Japan's confidence would meet the weapon that symbolized America's industrial genius, the Browning M2 50 caliber machine gun. The encounter would become one of the most sobering moments in the Pacific War, a collision not of machines, but of civilizations, industrial philosophies, and the limits of human belief. The Pacific sun had barely risen when the first wave of U.S. Marines came ashore on Saipan. Behind them, the ocean churned with landing craft and columns of M4 Sherman tanks rolling down ramps like a mechanical tide. For the Americans, this was not just another island. Saipan was the gateway to Japan's homeland, a strip of volcanic earth that would place B-29 Super Fortress bombers within range of Tokyo itself. For the Japanese, it was the last line of defense before the war reached their front door. Defending the island were some 30,000 Japanese troops, including Colonel Takashi Goto's 9th Tank Regiment, a force of 44 tanks, a mix of Type 95 Hagos and Type 97 Chihas, Japan's medium tanks in name only. The Chiha's 57mm gun offered slightly better punch, but its armor barely thicker than the Hagos remained paper-thin by 1944 standards. Yet the crews were confident. Many were veterans of China and Malaya. They had been told their tanks were agile, reliable, and battle-proven. They believed their speed would once again offset American numbers. On the night of June 16th, under the shroud of darkness, Goto's regiment prepared for a counterattack. Mechanics checked track tension, tightened bolts, and filled fuel tanks. Tankers cleaned their 37mm and 57mm guns, stacking ammunition neatly inside their cramped hulls. Most of them had no radios. Orders would be given by flares, hand signals, and trust. They were about to launch the largest armored assault Japan had ever mounted in the Pacific. By 3:00 a.m. on June 17th, diesel engines rumbled to life across the hills. The sound rolled across the fields, deep, metallic, and unmistakable. American sentries heard it first, a dull vibration in the ground that grew into a mechanical roar. Engines Multiple 1 Marine reported over the radio. The defenders braced for impact. Sherman tank crews scrambled from their foxholes loading high explosive shells into breaches. Anti-tank gun teams adjusted their sights, and in the shallow trenches between them, Marine machine gunners cocked the bolts of their Browning M2 heavy machine guns, weapons originally designed to shoot down aircraft. Then the Japanese came. 44 tanks crested the ridge in formation, diesel fumes trailing behind like ghosts in the moonlight. Some carried infantry clinging to the hull's rifles ready for the charge. The Hagos, their engines screaming at full throttle, bounced violently over the volcanic terrain, suspension arms jerking like nervous limbs. The Marines watched as dark silhouettes drew closer, 300 meters, then 200. Then the first American machine gun opened fire. The 50 caliber rounds left the barrels with a thunderous rhythm, boom, 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 at nearly 900 meters per second. Tracer streaks arced through the night like red lightning slamming into the lead Hago's hull. To the astonishment of both sides, the bullets didn't ricochet. They punched straight through. Sparks erupted inside the tank. Diesel smoke began to pour from its rear deck. The machine gunner adjusted aim, firing another burst. This time the bullets went through one side of the turret and out the other, tearing through the commander inside. The tank lurched forward, then stopped abruptly, its engine dying mid-gear. The Marines couldn't quite believe it. Their machine guns were killing tanks. All along the line, M2 Brownings joined in. Mounted on jeeps, half-tracks, and sandbagged positions, the guns formed a wall of fire. At 200 meters, a 50 caliber armor-piercing round could pierce 23 millimeters of hardened steel, nearly double the Hago's maximum armor thickness. At 500 meters, it could still punch through 19 millimeters. The Japanese tanks, with no sloped armor and riveted plates that often popped loose under stress, had no defense. Inside the tanks, chaos reigned. Rounds whistled through the thin steel walls, shattering instruments, slicing through ammunition racks, and ricocheting in fiery arcs. The crews, 3 men packed shoulder to shoulder, had nowhere to hide. One American gunner later described seeing sparks through the slits like the tank was catching fire from the inside. The psychological shock was immediate. The Japanese had trained for years believing that small arms fire was useless against armor. Now the very premise of their survival had been shattered in seconds. One captured tank officer, interrogated days later, confessed that he thought the Americans had invented a new secret weapon. He couldn't accept that a machine gun the same type he had seen on trucks and aircraft could destroy a tank, but the physics were undeniable. The Type 95's 12mm armor was enough to deflect rifle bullets, but not a 12.7mm round, moving at nearly 3 times the speed of sound. Each hit turned the Hago into a drum of ricocheting steel fragments. The face-hardened armor designed to shatter small-caliber projectiles fractured when struck by the kinetic energy of the Browning's rounds. For the tank crews, every impact was a death sentence delayed by seconds. Meanwhile, the Shermans moved in. Their 75mm guns dwarfed the Japanese 37mm weapons in both size and power. When the Americans fired, the result was annihilation. One round could punch clean through a Hago and explode on the far side. Tanks burned their ammunition, cooking off in secondary detonations that lit the battlefield like flares. Yet amid the chaos, the battle revealed something deeper than just a mismatch of firepower. It exposed a philosophical divide, two different worlds of war. Japan had built tanks as tools of infantry support, cheap and mobile, designed for colonial campaigns and spiritual warfare. The United States built tanks as industrial products engineered for integration, each part standardized, each gun synchronized with infantry, artillery, and air power. The Marines' success on Saipan was not merely tactical, it was systemic. As dawn broke over the blackened fields, the full cost of the Japanese counterattack became clear. 31 tanks lay scattered across the landscape, smoking wrecks twisted and torn open. In some, the armor plates bore neat circular holes, 50 caliber entries on one side, ragged exits on the other. Marines walked among them, pointing in disbelief. "You could stick your fist through the holes," one officer said. For the Japanese survivors, the realization was devastating. They had not just lost a battle. They had lost faith in their machines, in their doctrine, in their leaders' promises of parity. The myth of the invincible Hago was dead, pierced not by artillery shells, but by the relentless precision of American engineering. And as the smoke settled over Saipan, the U.S. Marines, hardened by 2 years of island warfare, understood something equally sobering. The Pacific War was no longer a contest of courage or tactics. It was a war of industries fought between an empire that dreamed and a nation that built. When dawn broke over Saipan on June 17, 1944, the battlefield resembled a scrapyard of burning steel. Smoke drifted lazily upward from shattered hulls, the air heavy with the smell of diesel gunpowder and scorched paint. Marines cautiously approached the wreckage, rifles raised, unsure whether any Japanese tankers still hid inside. The answer came in silence. Most of the crews had perished, where they sat, victims of a weapon that had rewritten the rules of war, the Browning 50 caliber machine gun. It was a revelation as shocking as it was brutal. For years, the U.S. military had viewed heavy machine guns as anti-personnel or anti-aircraft weapons tools for suppression, not tank killing. But on Saipan, the Marines had stumbled upon a truth born of mathematics, not mythology. Their M2 Brownings, firing 12.7mm armor-piercing rounds, could penetrate twice the armor thickness of a Type 95 Hago. The result was not a battle. It was an execution. At the height of the assault, tracers from dozens of Brownings had carved fiery lines through the pre-dawn dark. Tanks that once seemed terrifying became silhouettes punctured by orange sparks, their armor yielding like tin. One Marine described it later as watching a steel box bleed light. The Americans had not expected their guns to be so devastating. Some had fired simply to delay the enemy until the Shermans arrived. By the time the Shermans joined, the fight was already decided. The Japanese 9th Tank Regiment had charged forward with 44 tanks, the largest armored counterattack Japan ever launched in the Pacific. By sunrise, 31 were destroyed, their remains scattered across the cane fields and coral ridges. Another handful lay immobilized, engines ruined by gunfire treads, torn by grenades or thermite grenades hurled by infantry. Marines moving among the wrecks that morning realized they had witnessed something extraordinary, the collapse of a military illusion. When they examined the wrecks up close, the evidence was irrefutable. The armor was thin, brittle, and flat, offering no protection against the energy of the American rounds. On several tanks, the entry and exit holes from the 50 caliber fire were clean, symmetrical circles, almost surgical in precision. The bullets had traveled straight through their kinetic energy, shredding the interior like a blender. You could trace the trajectory of death itself, a hole through the turret wall, a splatter of melted metal inside, and another hole on the far side where the round exited. A Marine lieutenant recalled calling over his men to look at one particular tank. See that hole? That's from a 50. Went in here, came out there. You could put your whole fist through it. These tanks weren't armored. They were coffins. What they saw reflected not just the weakness of one machine, but the fragility of an entire empire's industrial foundation. Japan's wartime production had been designed for limited continental wars campaigns against China and colonial forces in Asia, where terrain and logistics favored light vehicles. In those environments, the Hago had excelled. It could travel over rice paddies fit on narrow jungle trails and run for hours on a few dozen gallons of diesel. Against Chinese warlords or poorly equipped militias, its thin armor was irrelevant. But on Saipan, the Hago was facing the most industrialized military force in human history. America's war economy had reached a scale Japan could not even measure. The same factories that had built automobiles and refrigerators now built tanks, planes, and ships at a rate no empire could match. In June 1944 alone, the same month as the Saipan invasion, the United States produced 1,100 M4 Sherman tanks and 8,000 aircraft. Japan, by contrast, could barely manufacture 20 tanks that month, most of them obsolete before they left the assembly line. The difference wasn't just in quantity, it was in philosophy. American design emphasized standardization and redundancy, a system where every bolt turret and radio could be replaced anywhere in the world. Japan's tanks, by comparison, were crafted, not manufactured, each built almost by hand, with variations that made mass maintenance impossible. The same cultural perfectionism that had once fueled Japan's rise now slowed it down. In a war of machines, perfection was the enemy of production. Even so, Japan's commanders continued to believe that courage could compensate for material inferiority. The doctrine of Seishin fighting spirit remained central to the Imperial Army's training and propaganda. Tank crews were told that moral strength would offset thin armor and small guns. A tank's true armor is the heart of its crew, one field manual proclaimed. But no amount of willpower could stop a bullet traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Captured officers from Saipan struggled to make sense of what they had seen. One whose tank had been disabled by a burst of .50 caliber fire told American interrogators that he thought the U.S. must have developed a special gun for tanks disguised as a machine gun. Another confessed that even after seeing the holes in his own vehicle, he refused to believe ordinary infantry weapons could do that. For the Imperial Army, which had built its mythology on invincibility, this was not just defeat, it was a psychological rupture. American intelligence officers compiled these interviews into a report titled Enemy Armor Lessons from Saipan. The document circulated among Marine units preparing for upcoming invasions of Tinian, Peleliu, and Okinawa. Its conclusion was simple. The Type 95 Hago is not a tank. It is an illusion of one. From that moment, the U.S. Marines adjusted their tactics. Heavy machine guns were now positioned specifically for anti-armor defense, no longer just for infantry support. Marines were told in briefings, "If you see a Japanese tank, don't call for artillery. Don't wait for armor. Fire your .50. The tactical transformation was immediate. Japanese armor, once feared in the early days of the war, became just another target, no more threatening than a truck or bunker. Marines lost the fear that had once gripped them during Guadalcanal, when tanks had seemed unstoppable. On Saipan, the illusion had died with the sunrise. But as the Americans advanced across the island and the Japanese dead were buried in the volcanic soil, another realization took root, one that went beyond tactics or technology. It was the realization that industrial power itself had become the true weapon of war. The Hago had been designed in an empire that believed in craftsmanship and courage. The 50 caliber Browning came from a nation that believed in systems and logistics, in numbers and the invisible machinery of supply. One was built for the battlefield of the past, the other for the total wars of the future. And on Saipan, in that brief and brutal clash, one world ended and another began. By the time the last fires burned out on Saipan's cane fields, the fate of Japan's armored forces was sealed not just in defeat, but in irrelevance. The Type 95 Heigo, once a symbol of Japanese ingenuity, had become a relic overnight. Its shattered remains told the story of a nation that had built for yesterday's war and found itself trapped in tomorrow's. For the Americans, the aftermath was a study in contrast. Where the Japanese relied on craftsmanship and courage, the U.S. relied on logistics, production, and precision. Every Sherman tank that rolled off a landing craft had been built, tested, and shipped across an ocean with mathematical efficiency. Behind each vehicle stood an invisible army of factory workers, men and women whose labor turned Detroit, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh into the greatest arsenal the world had ever seen. The Marines who inspected the wrecked Japanese tanks that morning understood instinctively what historians would later formalize Japan's defeat was not the result of inferior bravery, but of industrial starvation. A few tanks lay with their turrets blown off, others pierced cleanly through both sides, as if giant needles had threaded through them. When engineers from the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps later examined the captured wrecks, they confirmed what combat had already proven: the Hago's armor was never meant for this kind of war. Its 12mm plates were face-hardened to resist small arms fire, but they shattered under high-velocity impacts. The same design meant to make it lighter also made it brittle. Each destroyed tank became a symbol of Japan's strategic miscalculation. Engineers had built the Heigo for fast colonial campaigns in China against warlords with rifles, not Marines with Brownings. The Japanese high command had bet on the wrong future, assuming that morale and maneuver could substitute for metallurgy and mass production. That bet, like so many others in Japan's wartime planning, ended in flames. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the United States had built an industrial civilization for war. The numbers tell the story better than any general's memoir by 1944. American factories were producing 96,000 aircraft, 57,000 tanks, and over 17 million tons of shipping per year. Japan, blockaded and resource-starved, managed only a fraction of that, barely 28,000 aircraft and a few thousand light tanks. Each Japanese tank destroyed on Saipan was more than a tactical loss. It was the visible symptom of an economy collapsing under the weight of total war. And yet, inside those thin metal coffins, Japanese crews fought with a devotion that haunted even their enemies. Marines who later recounted the battle spoke not with mockery, but with an odd respect. They kept coming, one said, even when their tanks were burning. It was the same pattern that would repeat at Tinian Palelu Iwo Jima and Okinawa, courage consumed by arithmetic. From the strategic level, the Battle of Saipan marked more than the destruction of Japan's tank forces. It marked the collapse of an entire doctrine. Japan's military had built its armored corps on the assumption that tanks existed to support infantry, not to dominate the battlefield. The Hago had been designed for mobility and psychological impact, the idea that a few fast-moving tanks could scatter poorly equipped troops. Against modern mechanized forces, this concept was suicide. When General Holland Smith, commanding the U.S. Marine assault, read the intelligence summaries after the battle, he was astonished at how outdated the Japanese vehicles were. "They're fighting us," he said, "with the tanks of another decade." He wasn't wrong. The Heigo, finalized in 1935, was a pre-war design conceived before radar, before dive bombers, before the concept of total mechanized warfare had matured. It belonged to the age of cavalry tactics, not the industrial one. And yet, to understand why Japan clung to it one must look beyond engineering to economics, geography, and ideology. Japan's empire was built on resource extraction, not resource creation. The islands lacked iron ore, coal, and oil in sufficient quantities. Even with conquests in Manchuria and Southeast Asia, its industrial base remained fragile, dependent on shipping lanes that the U.S. Navy would later choke off completely. Every ton of steel used for a tank was a ton not used for a ship or aircraft. In that calculus, light tanks made sense at least until they met the industrial full force of America's war machine. By 1944, the Japanese leadership understood this reality, but it was too late. Plans existed for heavier tanks like the Type 3 Chinu and the Type 4 Chito, both armed with 75mm guns and thicker armor. But production barely began. Only 166 Chinus were ever completed, most never leaving Japan. The Chito, theoretically capable of matching the Sherman, remained a prototype. When the Imperial General Headquarters prioritized resources, it chose kamikaze aircraft and coastal defenses over tank production. Tanks would not save the home islands. Sacrifice would. In post-war interviews, surviving tank officers expressed bitterness, even shame. One veteran who had fought in China since 1937 told interrogators, "We were sent to fight the gods of steel with toys." Another said simply, "Our tanks were not weapons. They were graves." These were not the words of broken men, but of professionals who had seen their world collapse under the logic of industrial warfare. American analysts saw in that collapse a broader lesson. The U.S. Army's post-war logistics studies, later expanded by Rand, concluded that the decisive factor in modern warfare is not the quality of individual equipment, but the capacity to produce supply and replace it. The Hago was a perfect case study, technically competent, tactically obsolete, strategically fatal. Back in the United States, the lessons of Saipan filtered into industry education and policy. The arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt had once called it, was now an empirical truth. Detroit's production lines became symbols of victory, while Japan's artisanal workshops symbolized defeat. The war had proven that the future belonged not to the craftsman, but to the engineer of systems, to those who could mass-produce precision, not handcraft perfection. In the smoldering fields of Saipan, this truth was carved into every ruined tank. The Marines didn't just win a battle, they witnessed the death of an era. In the days following the Battle of Saipan, American engineers and intelligence officers descended upon the island's blackened terrain to study what the Marines had left behind. Among the wreckage lay dozens of twisted Type 95 Hago and Type 97 Chiha tanks, mute witnesses to the collision between two vastly different civilizations of war. What had once been Japan's most advanced armored vehicles were now dissected like archaeological relics, each hole and rivet offering a clue to the empire's undoing. At the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, several captured Hagos were later shipped and studied in detail. Engineers measured the armor plates with calipers, mapped bullet penetrations, and tested the hardness of the steel. Their conclusion was blunt: the armor was inadequate by any modern standard. The 12mm face-hardened plates, once considered sufficient to repel rifle fire, had fractured under the high kinetic energy of the 50 caliber Browning M2. A single sustained burst could turn the tank's thin shell into Swiss cheese. Even more revealing was the internal layout. Inside the tank, the fighting compartment measured barely 50 cubic feet smaller than a walk-in closet. The commander had no seat, no powered traverse, no space to move. He had to load aim fire and direct all while standing in a turret that rotated by a hand crank. Below him, the driver sat wedged between steel plates, relying on a narrow periscope and a slit barely wider than a matchbox. Beside him, the hull machine gunner crouched in an alcove so cramped that his knees nearly touched the breech of his weapon. There were no shock absorbers, no insulation against noise or heat. The air inside could reach 120 degrees N 49 degrees after minutes of combat. American tank crews who climbed into the captured Hago could scarcely believe men fought in them. Compared to the M4 Sherman, which provided more than 150 cubic feet of workspace and separate stations for each crew member, the Japanese tank was a coffin on tracks. The Sherman's power traverse allowed its turret to rotate smoothly in seconds. The Hago's crank could take 20 full turns to swing from one side to the other. The difference was not just mechanical, it was philosophical. America built machines for efficiency and endurance. Japan built machines for obedience and sacrifice. This difference was born from necessity as much as culture. Japan's wartime industry was a study in constraint. Cut off from major resource supplies by geography and later by American submarines, the empire's factories faced constant shortages of steel, rubber, and fuel. Its engineers compensated with ingenuity, designing lighter tanks that could operate on diesel, which was more plentiful than gasoline. But this trade-off came at a cost. The lighter armor and smaller guns that had seemed clever in 1936 became fatal in 1944. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, America's industrial engine roared without limit. At the Detroit Tank Arsenal, built by Chrysler in 1940, production lines stretched for miles under one roof. Overhead cranes swung entire hulls from one assembly line to another. In December 1942 alone, that single factory produced 97 M4 Shermans, more tanks in 1 month than Japan built in an entire year. The contrast was staggering. 10 major U.S. manufacturers, including Fisher Body Baldwin Locomotive Pressed Steel Car and Pullman Standard, produced nearly 50,000 Shermans by war's end. Japan produced just 300 Hagos in total. Even more telling than the numbers was the network behind them. Each American tank was the end product of a national ecosystem: steel from Pittsburgh engines, from Ford radios, from RCA optics, from Westinghouse. When a Sherman rolled off the line, it represented not a single company, but an entire civilization mobilized for production. Japan, by contrast, lacked both scale and integration. Its factories operated independently, often producing small batches with little standardization. A part made for one Hago might not fit another. For the Marines, the implications were immediate and practical. Reports from Saipan circulated through command channels under the heading Tank Vulnerability in Pacific Operations. The findings were clear. Japanese armor could be destroyed by 50 caliber machine guns, bazookas, or 37mm anti-tank guns at short range. Field manuals were updated accordingly. Machine gun crews were now trained to identify weak points, side armor, turret flanks, and rear engine compartments. The instructions were blunt: do not waste artillery on Japanese tanks. Engage with heavy machine guns. Aim for sides and rear. Maintain sustained fire until immobilized. This tactical shift did more than save ammunition. It reshaped battlefield psychology. The fear that had gripped Marines during early Pacific campaigns, when Japanese tanks were seen as indestructible monsters, evaporated. On Saipan, and later at Tinian and Okinawa, Marines treated them as little more than mobile targets. One after-action report summarized it grimly: Japanese tanks present no exceptional threat. Courage cannot compensate for design. Yet behind that bureaucratic language lay something more profound: the recognition that industrial warfare had eclipsed human valor. Japanese crews had fought with determination, but their courage was entombed in outdated machinery. Every shattered Hago on Saipan was a monument to that paradox: men who believed their steel would protect them only to discover it was paper. The disparity extended far beyond armor thickness. Communication coordination and crew survivability all favored the Americans. Every Sherman carried a radio. Only 1 in 4 Japanese tanks did. Every Sherman had standardized ammunition racks. fire suppression systems, and optical sights calibrated to the gun. The Heigo had none of these. When hit, its thin armor tended to spall, sending molten shards ricocheting inside the compartment, killing crewmen instantly. Survivors were often burned alive as diesel fuel ignited. Captured Japanese manuals later revealed that tankers were explicitly trained to fight to the death. Abandoning a vehicle, even a burning one, was considered dishonor. Many chose to remain inside, turning their tanks into funeral pyres. Marines found charred remains of crews still gripping their weapons melted into their stations. It was a horrifying testament to the cultural divide the American soldier fought to win. The Japanese soldier fought to die well. Post-war analysts at the Rand Corporation would later use these encounters as case studies in what they termed strategic misalignment. Japan's wartime leadership, they wrote, had built a military optimized for limited wars of ideology, not total wars of production. In other words, Japan designed for victory in 1937, but found itself fighting 1944. The gap between vision and reality was measured in steel-thickness fuel barrels and human lives. When news of Saipan reached Tokyo, the shock reverberated far beyond the battlefield. The loss of the Marianas meant that B-29 bombers could now reach Tokyo, but it also carried symbolic weight. For the first time, the Japanese government admitted publicly that the war was not going as planned. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo resigned within weeks. Emperor Hirohito himself reportedly asked his ministers how the Americans had managed such dominance. The answer whispered in bureaucratic reports was simple. They have factories. From the muddy beaches of Saipan to the polished floors of the Pentagon, the lesson was undeniable. Technology doctrine and courage mattered, but in the age of mechanized war, industry decided destiny. The Hago was more than a failed tank. It was the ghost of a nation's misplaced faith, a machine that fought bravely and died proving that no empire, no matter how determined, can outfight arithmetic. The wrecks of Saipan were more than the detritus of a battle. They were physical proof of a truth that had quietly defined the entire Pacific War. When American Marines walked among the burned-out Japanese tanks, they were not just witnessing the failure of a single weapon. They were witnessing the limits of an entire system of thought. The Type 95 Heigo had not failed because its crews lacked courage or its designers lacked skill. It had failed because Japan's understanding of modern war had been overtaken by time itself. From the very beginning, the Hago was born of strategic compromise. In the 1930s, Japan's Imperial Army saw armor as a supporting element, a tool to back infantry, not a decisive force of its own. Their generals, veterans of the Russo-Japanese War and campaigns in China, still viewed battle as a contest of will rather than logistics. Tanks were extensions of the samurai spirit, not products of industry. The result was a machine built with an almost ascetic minimalism fast light and designed for the jungles of Asia, not the industrial meat grinder of the 1940s. Yet by the time Japan faced the United States, the world had changed. The wars in Europe had revealed what true mechanized warfare looked like: the Panzer Blitzkrieg, the Soviet T-34 revolution, the industrial arms race of armor thickness versus gun velocity. While the rest of the world moved toward 30-ton monsters of steel, Japan's army still clung to 7-ton designs conceived a decade earlier. They mistook mobility for modernity and confidence for capability. At the Aberdeen Proving Ground, American engineers dissecting captured Heigos began to see patterns that reflected this misplaced philosophy. Every element of the tank, its riveted armor, plates, its hand-cranked turret, its lack of radio integration, pointed to a pre-war mindset. It was a weapon optimized for control and simplicity, not for adaptation. As one report summarized, it is as if the tank were designed by men who believed the battlefield would never change. What made that statement even more damning was the evidence coming from across the Pacific. In Europe, Allied tankers faced Tigers and Panthers machines whose guns could destroy a Sherman from a mile away. In the Pacific, Marines faced tanks that could be killed by a .50 caliber machine gun or a single bazooka. The disparity was not just in power, but in philosophy. Germany fought a technological war. Japan fought a spiritual one. Even within Japan, there were those who knew the truth. Reports from officers returning from Mongolia after the Khalkhin-Gol conflict in 1939 warned that Soviet 45mm guns had easily penetrated Japanese armor. Engineers proposed new designs, the Type 1 Chi-Hei and the Type 3 Chi-Nu, both with heavier guns and armor. But these recommendations fell victim to bureaucratic inertia and resource scarcity. The Navy demanded steel for aircraft carriers and submarines. The Army was left with leftovers. When the Chi-Nu finally entered limited production in 1944, it was already too late. In contrast, America's industrial base had become a machine of war in the most literal sense. At the height of wartime production, the United States was turning out one new tank every 30 minutes, one aircraft every 5 minutes, and one ship every day. Behind those numbers were not just factories, but systems, standardized parts, interchangeable crews, and a logistics chain that stretched from Texas oil fields to Pacific airstrips. The Japanese Heigo was not merely outgunned, it was outsupplied, outbuilt, and outlasted. On the battlefield, the effects were devastating. After Saipan Marine units were briefed to treat Japanese tanks as soft targets, they no longer called for artillery support or anti-tank guns. The Browning M2 .50 caliber became the frontline tank killer mounted on Jeeps, half-tracks, and Sherman turrets alike. Training films produced by the U.S. War Department used Saipan footage as a teaching tool, showing Marines firing into abandoned Heigos, the rounds punching through one side and out the other. The narration was clinical. At 200 yards, the .50 caliber armor-piercing round penetrates the Heigo's side armor completely. At 100 yards, it passes through both sides. To the American viewer, it was a lesson in firepower. To the Japanese, it was humiliation made mechanical. By 1945, Japanese tankers knew they were fighting with museum pieces. Reports from Okinawa and Iwo Jima describe crews digging their tanks into the ground, burying everything but the turret, to use them as stationary pillboxes. It was an act of pragmatism, the only way to turn fragile mobility into fixed defense. But it was also an act of despair when the 27th Tank Regiment committed its final 27 tanks on Okinawa, 13 Type 95s and 14 Type 97s. They were wiped out in hours by a force that outnumbered them 30-1. Some were destroyed by Shermans, others by flamethrowers or simple grenades dropped into hatches. After each battle, American ordnance officers inspected the remains and updated their data. Every destroyed tank told a statistical story, penetration angles, round velocities, spall effects. These reports were forwarded not only to Marine Command, but to the Army Service Forces in Washington, where analysts were already thinking beyond victory. They wanted to know what had caused Japan's industrial failure. Why had such a modern nation fallen so far behind? Their conclusion was chilling in its simplicity. Japan had entered the war with a 1930s industrial base trying to fight a 1940s industrial war. Its engineers were capable, its workers skilled, but its economy could not scale. The U.S. could build 50,000 tanks because it had 300,000 machine tools, 40,000 industrial designers, and a supply chain that could replace every broken part in days. Japan had none of that. Its production was handcrafted, fragile, and dependent on imports that U.S. submarines had already strangled. The Rand Corporation, studying post-war economic data, later called this the industrial inflection point. the moment when mechanized warfare ceased to be about tactics and became about throughput. Victory no longer belonged to the bravest or the best trained, but to the nation that could move the most steel, refine the most oil, and ship the most tons of equipment to the front. For Japan, that realization came too late. For America, it became doctrine. When surviving Hagos were finally shipped to the United States for full testing in late 1945, the engineers treated them almost like fossils. They measured not just dimensions, but history, the story of a country that had believed it could substitute faith for factories. One Aberdeen technician wrote in his report, "The Japanese tank is well built within its limits. The tragedy is that its limits were set by a government that never understood the future." By then, Japan's empire was gone. Its cities lay in ruins, its factories in ashes, and its tanks, once the pride of the Imperial Army, sat silent in American warehouses, their rivets rusting, their legacy sealed. On the battlefield of Saipan, the .50 caliber gun had killed the tank. In history, it had killed an illusion. In the final year of the war, as the embers of the Pacific Campaign spread toward Japan's home islands, the lesson of Saipan became prophecy. Wherever Japanese tanks appeared, they met the same fate. Their armor, once a symbol of imperial strength, had become transparent in the face of modern firepower. But the Hagos' defeat was not just a battlefield anecdote, it was the reflection of a dying empire that could no longer manufacture survival. On Tinian, just weeks after Saipan, 7 Type 95s were destroyed in a single night. The battle was brief, mechanical, almost impersonal. The Marines, forewarned by intelligence reports and their own experience, waited in ambush with .50 caliber Brownings mounted on jeeps and sandbagged emplacements. When the Japanese armor advanced under moonlight, the Americans opened fire with clockwork precision. Within 10 minutes, it was over. The Marines found themselves standing amid smoking wrecks, not exhilarated but grimly aware of how uneven the fight had become. By Peleliu, in September 1944, the Japanese no longer used tanks for mobility at all. Their engineers began burying them in coral ridges and jungle pits, turning them into static bunkers. The Type 95s and Chiha mediums were entombed halfway into the earth, their turrets repurposed as fixed gun positions. The tank, once a symbol of offensive power, had devolved into a glorified pillbox. Even then, the armor was too thin to stop American weapons. Flamethrowers and 75mm Sherman shells turned those bunkers into infernos. By Iwo Jima, the degradation was complete. Colonel Takeichi Nishi, a former Olympic equestrian and commander of the 26th Tank Regiment, had his tanks buried almost completely, not as weapons, but as instruments of delay. He knew the truth: his tanks could not fight. They could only die well. Each Hago was dug into volcanic ash until only its turret protruded like a tombstone. When American flamethrower tanks rolled forward, they treated these buried machines not as adversaries, but as obstacles to be cleared. The tragedy of these scenes was not lost on American observers. Many Marines who had fought across the Pacific began to see Japanese armor less as a threat and more as a symbol of sacrifice, a desperate attempt by a fading empire to hold back the inevitable. A corporal in the 4th Marine Division described it best. You could tell they believed in what they were doing, but they were fighting a war that had already passed them by. Japan's tankers were trained for combat that no longer existed. Their doctrines emphasized shock and courage, the notion that surprise attacks and fast movements could overcome superior numbers. This had worked in Malaya and the Philippines, where British and American forces were unprepared. But by 1944, the Allies had adapted. The Marines brought radar-directed artillery, radio-coordinated air support, and fleets of amphibious armor. Against such machinery, bravery became a liability. Inside the Japanese high command, frustration was growing. The few officers who understood the scale of industrial disparity, men like General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, argued for new armored development. But Japan's resources were exhausted. Its steel output had collapsed by 70% since 1942. Fuel production crippled by Allied submarine warfare, and the loss of the Dutch East Indies oil fields had fallen to a tenth of what the army required. The imperial government redirected everything to air defense and kamikaze aircraft. Tanks, they decided, would play no decisive role in defending the homeland. The United States, by contrast, was accelerating. Its industrial output had reached levels never seen in human history. The Detroit arsenal alone produced more armor in 1 month than Japan built during the entire war. On the home front, entire cities had become extensions of the battlefield. Women welding tank hulls, teenagers riveting aircraft frames, supply convoys shipping hundreds of thousands of tons of steel across the Pacific every week. This economic machine reshaped the nature of warfare. For every Sherman destroyed, 2 replacements were already on a ship heading west. For every Browning 50 caliber used in combat, dozens more sat crated in depots from Hawaii to Guam. America's war had become algorithmic, governed by numbers, logistics, and the arithmetic of production. Japan's, by contrast, remained heroic, driven by faith, not factories, and faith could not armor steel. The last great armored counterattack of the Japanese Empire came on Okinawa in May 1945. The 27th Tank Regiment, equipped with just 27 tanks, 13 Type 95 Hagos, and 14 Type 97 Chiha mediums, was ordered to assault American lines. Facing them were over 800 U.S. tanks and hundreds of anti-tank weapons. It was an act of defiance, not strategy. The battle lasted less than 2 hours. The Japanese formation was annihilated, their tanks burning along the ridgelines of Shuri Castle. Survivors reported that the 50 caliber fire was so intense that the ground around their vehicles glowed red with tracer impacts. After Okinawa, Japanese tank warfare ceased to exist. The few armored units remaining in Manchuria and the Kuril Islands waited for a Soviet invasion they could not hope to resist. When it came in August 1945, the Red Army's T-34-85s swept through in days. Their 76mm guns tore through the Japanese tanks with contemptuous ease. At Shumshu Island, 21 Japanese tanks were destroyed within 2 hours. The Soviet commander later noted in his after-action report, Japanese tanks displayed bravery, but no threat. And with that, the armored dream of the Japanese Empire ended where it had begun in illusion. Historians would later point out that Japan's real weakness was never tactical, but systemic. Its military-industrial complex was fragmented, its priorities divided between the Army and Navy, and its ideology blind to economics. While American strategists like George C. Marshall and Dwight Eisenhower built war around supply chains, Japan built war around spirit. The result was inevitable. As the war ended, surviving Japanese officers faced a bitter truth. The tanks they had worshipped as invincible had not even been adequate. The Hago, once a proud emblem of modernity, had become a metaphor for outdated thinking, for national hubris, and for the danger of believing that courage could outpace industry. In the ruins of Tokyo, the Ministry of War prepared its final reports for surrender. One document recovered by Allied occupation forces contained a haunting line: "We built weapons for a war of the past. The enemy built weapons for a war of the world to come." That single sentence captured the essence of Japan's failure, not moral but mechanical, not human but systemic. On the battlefields of Saipan, Tinian, and Okinawa, the 50 caliber machine gun had done more than pierce armor. It had pierced myth. When Japan finally surrendered on August 15, 1945, the rusted carcasses of its armored divisions lay strewn from Burma to the Philippines, from Saipan to the craters of Okinawa. What had begun a decade earlier, as the proud mechanization of the Imperial Army ended as a graveyard of twisted steel. The Type 95. Heigo, once hailed as a triumph of Japanese design, now sat in foreign museums and scrapyards, a symbol of a nation that had built machines of war without the means to sustain them. In the aftermath, the United States military turned its attention not just to victory, but to understanding. The war had revealed a truth as profound as it was. Humbling power was no longer measured in courage or even tactics, but in supply chains, energy reserves, and engineering precision. At bases from Guam to Pearl Harbor, American ordnance officers collected the remains of Japanese tanks, shipping dozens back across the Pacific for post-war study. At the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, engineers once again examined their captured machines under controlled conditions. Each Heigo was tested, dissected, and cataloged. What they found confirmed the battlefield reports: poor metallurgy, weak armor seams, and outdated transmission systems. Yet these same engineers couldn't help but admire certain aspects of the design: the compact diesel engine, the lightweight, the reliability in tropical conditions. It was a good 1935 tank, one engineer wrote, but they were fighting a 1945 war. Those 10 years represented not just a technological gap, but an entire epoch in industrial evolution. During that decade, the United States had transitioned from peacetime manufacturing to the world's first true military-industrial complex, an interconnected web of companies, laboratories, and universities that could design, test, and mass-produce new weapons faster than any empire in history. Japan, isolated by geography and ideology, had done the opposite. It had preserved a pre-war mindset, clinging to craftsmanship when the world had moved to automation. The Americans learned something else too. When they interviewed Japanese tank designers and factory managers during the Allied occupation, they discovered that many of them knew their machines were obsolete. One engineer from the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries plant in Nagoya admitted to his American interrogators, "We were told to build light tanks that could float and climb mountains, not fight the enemy's armor. We built what the generals wanted, not what the war required." This was a damning revelation. Japan's military had not failed because its engineers were incompetent. They had failed because its bureaucracy refused to adapt. Strategic dogma had become doctrine. Doctrine had become dogma. Meanwhile, in Washington, analysts from the Office of Strategic Services (OSS) and later the Rand Corporation began drafting what would become a cornerstone of post-war military planning: the economics of warfare. Their reports drew directly from case studies like the Heigo. The conclusions were stark. Nations that fail to align industrial capacity with military doctrine lose modern wars. Tactical brilliance cannot compensate for logistical poverty. Machines win battles when they can be built, fueled, and repaired faster than they are destroyed. These ideas shaped everything that followed, from America's Cold War rearmament to its modern doctrines of logistics dominance. The Heigo, in its defeat, had become a teacher. In Japan, the post-war reconstruction process began under the supervision of General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied powers. Among his many reforms, MacArthur ordered a comprehensive demilitarization of Japan's armament industries. Factories that once built tanks were redirected to make tractors, buses, and industrial machinery. Mitsubishi, Hitachi, and Kawasaki names, once etched into tank hulls, now produced engines for civilian vehicles and construction equipment. The machines that had once carried soldiers to war would now rebuild their nation. It was a stunning transformation. Within a decade, Japan's former tank plants became part of the foundation of its economic miracle. The same precision engineering that had failed in war now thrived in peace. By the 1960s, Japan had become a global industrial power again, this time exporting cars, not tanks, electronics, not bullets. The lesson of the Heigo was not lost on its engineers. They learned that survival depended not on conquering territory, but on mastering efficiency. Meanwhile, American historians re-examined the Pacific Campaign through a new lens. The victories at Saipan, Tinian, and Okinawa were no longer seen solely as feats of courage, but as triumphs of logistics and adaptation. In 1944, U.S. forces had faced enemies who were brave, determined, and strategically imaginative, but their bravery had been betrayed by their machines. As one Marine veteran put it years later, "They fought like lions, but they drove tin cans." The symbolism was powerful. The Hago light and under-armored became shorthand for the fatal intersection of arrogance and underestimation. In countless post-war analyses, military scholars cited Japan's tank development as the quintessential example of a nation failing to modernize fast enough to match its ambitions. The United States Army's 1946 technical report concluded, "The Type 95 was a capable vehicle within its design intent. Its failure was not mechanical, but doctrinal. The weapon of the samurai was no longer the sword, it was the assembly line." That sentence, simple and profound, captured the essence of modern warfare. In the following decades, as Japan rebuilt and the world entered the nuclear age, military theorists continued to refer to the Hago when discussing the changing nature of power. It appeared in textbooks, lectures, and RAND briefings as a case study in technological stagnation. By the 1970s, it had become a metaphor, the Hago syndrome, the failure to update one's technology organization or assumptions to match reality. But not all saw it merely as a failure. Some Japanese historians later reclaimed the Hago as a product of its time, a necessary step in Japan's modernization, a machine that represented the nation's first attempt to merge Eastern and Western engineering philosophies. It was in a sense a reflection of the Japan that built it, resourceful, determined, overconfident, and ultimately doomed by circumstance. At the end of the war, American soldiers had laughed when their bullets tore through its armor. But decades later, historians treated it with something closer to respect, not for its strength, but for the story it told. The Hago was a mirror, and in it, the world saw the difference between power and preparation, between innovation and adaptation. In a war where the United States built tanks faster than Japan could build dreams, the Hago stood as both warning and epitaph. By 1946, the echoes of the Pacific War had quieted, but its lessons reverberated across continents. The Hago, once a symbol of Japanese conquest, was now a relic of industrial imbalance, a case study in how courage collapses under the weight of arithmetic. For historians, engineers, and strategists alike, this unassuming 7-ton tank had become a lens through which the entire Pacific War could be understood, a conflict where belief collided with manufacturing and where ideology shattered against steel. In the charred ruins of Yokohama, Tokyo, and Nagoya, American occupation teams cataloged Japan's surviving weapons. Among them were a few dozen Hago tanks, their armor pitted by gunfire and scarred by flame. Each was tagged, measured, and photographed before being scrapped or sent to the United States for study. The scene was clinical, but beneath the bureaucratic procedure lay a profound transformation, the conversion of war machines into data and of destruction into knowledge. The U.S. Army Ordnance Corps published its first comprehensive analysis of the Type 95 in early 1946. The report was unsparing, yet precise. It noted the Hago's advantages, its low maintenance, lightweight, and simplicity, but concluded that its design philosophy represents an era already obsolete before the Pacific War began. Engineers pointed to the hand-cranked turret traverse the riveted armor seams that became lethal fragments when hit, and the absence of radio communication. A tank, the report stated, is only as modern as the assumptions behind its design. That line would later be quoted in defense studies for decades. The broader post-war consensus was clear. Japan had built an army for the 1930s and then tried to fight a war of the 1940s, and in doing so, it revealed a fundamental truth about modern conflict, that wars are not won by those who fight hardest, but by those who produce longest. The industrial strength behind America's Sherman's B-29s and Liberty ships did more to decide the outcome than any single battle. At the Rand Corporation, newly established in 1948, analysts studying wartime production drew a direct parallel between Japan's defeat and the failures of other overextended powers throughout history. They called it the capacity gap, the widening distance between a nation's military ambitions and its industrial infrastructure. In Rand's early papers, the Higo appeared beside references to Napoleon's underfunded artillery and Imperial Russia's logistical collapse in World War I. In every case, the conclusion was the same: when doctrine outpaces production, defeat is only a matter of time. Meanwhile, in Japan, the humiliation of defeat became a crucible for rebirth. The nation's engineers, stripped of their military budgets, redirected their talents toward reconstruction. Former tank designers began working on industrial vehicles and heavy machinery. Mitsubishi, which had once built the Higo's diesel engines, pivoted to producing engines for commercial trucks. The same factories that once assembled tanks for Saipan now built engines for Tokyo's buses. In less than 2 decades, the transformation was complete. Japan, the nation that had lost the war of machines, became one of the world's industrial miracles. By the mid-1960s, its factories were exporting cars and electronics at a pace that stunned the same American economists who had once studied its wartime failures. Ironically, the lessons learned from defeat about efficiency, standardization, and quality control became the foundations of Japan's post-war success. The ghosts of the Higo had not been exorcised. They had been reinvented. Across the Pacific, American strategists took their own lessons from the tank's failure. The U.S. military-industrial complex that emerged after 1945 was designed to ensure such asymmetry would always remain in America's favor. The National Security Act of 1947 unified the armed forces, created the Department of Defense, and institutionalized coordination between government research and industry. The phrase "arsenal of democracy," coined during the war, evolved into a permanent reality. In that sense, the Higo's defeat had reshaped not only Japan's destiny, but America's future defense doctrine. The recognition that small design errors and limited production could doom entire armies became a guiding principle of Cold War planning. From the Korean War to Vietnam, U.S. forces would ensure that logistics, not heroism, determined strategy. Yet even as history moved on, the imagery of the Higo endured in military education. At the U.S. Army Armor School in Fort Knox, instructors used it to illustrate the danger of overconfidence in doctrine. "This is what happens," one veteran lecturer would say, pointing to photographs from Saipan, "when you build tanks for the last war instead of the next one." The irony was unmistakable. The Higo's original design had been born of the same intent to fight a future war Japan imagined, not the one it would actually face. In the jungles of China and the rice fields of Burma, it had worked. But against mechanized modernity, its thin armor was an epitaph. By the 1970s, as Japan's economy surged and its post-war self-defense forces modernized, new tanks rolled out of domestic factories, the Type 61 and later the Type 74. These machines were everything the Higo was not: heavily armored, radio-linked, and technologically sophisticated. Built under American oversight, but infused with Japanese precision, they stood as quiet rebukes to the past, not monuments of war, but monuments of learning. Still, the story of the Higo continued to haunt military historians. Its simplicity and its tragedy made it irresistible to those who studied the psychology of warfare. It symbolized the peril of institutional blindness, a condition in which armies cling to old assumptions because they mistake success for truth. The Japanese army had mistaken victory in China for proof of superiority, just as their opponents in Malaya and the Philippines had once underestimated them. Both sides had believed what they wanted to believe until reality broke through like a .50 caliber round through steel. In that sense, the Hago was more than a tank. It was a mirror reflecting how nations see themselves in war and how those illusions die in combat. When modern visitors walk through museums in Okinawa or Saipan, they often stop at the corroded frames of Japanese tanks displayed in memorial parks. The sun glints off the holes left by American bullets, the edges rusted into strange orange patterns. Children peer inside, marveling at how small the compartments are. Veterans sometimes stand silently before them, remembering the sound, the rhythmic hammering of the Browning M2, the smell of diesel and cordite, the sight of a machine burning under a Pacific dawn. What remains of the Hago today is not just metal, but message. It is the story of how the age of the sword became the age of steel, and how the age of steel gave way to the age of supply. It is proof that wars are not won by the bravest, nor by the most disciplined, but by those who understand time, who build for the world that is coming, not the one that has passed. And for those who still believe that valor alone can conquer machines, the Hago stands as a quiet monument to truth, a relic of faith shattered by physics, and of men who learned too late that courage cannot stop a bullet that goes straight through. As the embers of World War II cooled and the world reassembled itself amid the wreckage, the Hago tank faded into obscurity, but its meaning only deepened. To the victors, it was a cautionary exhibit. To the defeated, a reminder of misplaced faith. To historians, it became something larger still, a case study in how entire civilizations can misread the direction of progress, and how the price of that misreading is often paid in lives. The final years of the Pacific War had proven beyond doubt that industrial warfare was not merely about weapons, but about systems, production lines, shipping networks, fuel refineries, and logistical coordination that stretched from factories to foxholes. The Hago's defeat at Saipan had been inevitable, not because of inferior tactics, but because of the very world Japan had built around it. It was a nation designed for artisanal excellence, not mass production, for spiritual endurance, not material escalation. Against a foe that could build 50,000 Shermans, 100,000 aircraft, and millions of tons of munitions, Japan's courage became irrelevant. By 1945, the gap between the two nations had become incalculable. In just 1 year, the United States produced more steel than Japan had in the entire war. American shipyards launched a new vessel every single day. Its aircraft factories delivered a new bomber every hour. Detroit alone, once a city of cars, had transformed into a war engine capable of flooding 2 oceans with tanks. The irony was stark. When Japanese planners first conceived the Hago in the 1930s, they believed they were embracing modernity. They called it a mechanized samurai, agile, disciplined, unstoppable. But mechanization in the 1930s, Japan meant efficiency through craftsmanship. In 1940s, America, it meant scale through machinery. That difference of mindset, not metal, defined the Pacific War's outcome. In 1947, as part of Japan's demilitarization, the few remaining Hagos were melted down for scrap. Yet fragments survived. One sits today at the Yasukuni War Memorial Museum in Tokyo, its turret scarred by the unmistakable entry holes of .50 caliber rounds. Another stands preserved on Saipan, half buried in coral soil, its frame streaked with rust and salt. Tourists still climb on it for photographs, unaware that they're standing atop a symbol of one of history's great inflection points, the moment when the romantic idea of war gave way to the mechanical age. For scholars, the Hago's story became a metaphor for more than Japan. It represented every nation that mistakes ideology for capability, every general who assumes that willpower can substitute for logistics. The U.S. Naval War College began using Saipan as a teaching case in post-war strategy lectures. The title of one lesson was blunt, When Belief Meets Industry. The conclusion was blunter still. Technology does not forgive faith. By the mid-20th century, these lessons were already shaping the new world. The Cold War was not fought through Hagos and Shermans, but through missiles, satellites, and computers, products of continuous innovation rather than fixed doctrines. And yet, in the background of every arms race, analysts still invoked the ghost of Japan's light tanks. The question became, how do you avoid another Hago? How do you prevent a nation from falling behind in the very technology that defines its survival? For the United States, the answer was perpetual innovation. Research became institutionalized. Laboratories became as important as armies. RAND, DARPA, and the national laboratories formed the intellectual scaffolding of what President Eisenhower would later call the military-industrial complex. It was the logical heir to Detroit's wartime miracle, an engine designed not just to fight wars, but to stay ahead of them forever. For Japan, the answer was very different. Stripped of its military power and forced to rebuild from ruin, it chose reinvention over rivalry. The same spirit that once built tanks for conquest now built cars for peace. The precision engineering once used to forge cannon barrels now crafted cameras and radios. In a paradox, only history could craft the nation that had once tried to outgun America, now outproduced it in consumer goods, not weapons. Mitsubishi and Toyota, descendants of the war machine, became the architects of Japan's post-war identity. And yet amid all the prosperity, the lesson of the Hago remained unspoken, but not forgotten. In Japan's universities, military historians quietly taught it as a story of technological humility, a reminder that brilliance without adaptability is a form of blindness. The tank did not fail, one professor wrote in a 1965 analysis. The era around it changed. Across the Pacific, the U.S. Marines remembered it differently. Veterans of Saipan, now old men, recalled the night when they first realized that machine guns could kill tanks. "We didn't feel like heroes," one Marine said decades later. "It just felt wrong watching men die inside those things that couldn't protect them. It was like watching courage go to waste." The image lingered, a battlefield illuminated by tracer fire, the sharp metallic clang of bullets hitting armor, and the sudden silence when the engine stopped. In that moment, both sides had learned something eternal. The Americans learned that superiority is a function of preparation. The Japanese learned that valor without vision is defeat delayed. In the decades that followed, those truths shaped the peace that emerged from war. The United States built a global order grounded in industrial and technological dominance. Japan rebuilt itself into a pacifist power defined by efficiency and innovation. The Hago, in its quiet obsolescence, had been the crucible for both transformations. Today, in the age of drones and digital warfare, its story feels distant yet familiar. The machines have changed, but the principle remains the same. The battlefield is still ruled by the side that best understands the future, by those who adapt faster than their enemies can learn. The rusted Hago on Saipan is silent now, its gun barrel pointing toward the sea. Waves crash below the cliffs where it fell. Tourists walk past, taking photos, unaware that beneath their feet lies one of the clearest lessons history ever wrote in steel, that in the age of industry, courage without capacity is tragedy, that in the age of machines, faith without foresight is defeat, and that the .50 caliber bullet which tore through its armor did more than end a battle, It ended an era.